difficulties. We literally did like a full run through yesterday and everything worked completely smoothly. But so I'll start by talking off a little bit about nutrition. So I know this can be a little bit of a difficult topic. So if anyone does find it a little bit too much at any point, obviously please feel free to leave and maybe come back in like 5 minutes or so. But it's super duper important to talk about. And just to kind of show you that, we've got a few case studies here. So there was a study done on the England national football squad. They had like a nutritionist come in and look at them when they were doing a training camp. And it turned out that only one out of the whole of the 24 players was actually eating enough carbs, and 88% of them didn't have enough calories to actually match their training requirements, which is crazy if you think about that. That's like our elite England squad, and the fact that they weren't even fueling themselves properly. If an elite squad isn't doing it, it shows you how easy it is for probably just like your kind of everyday person. And we've got Pippa Founder. She's an athlete. She started to kind of feel really tired. She wasn't recovering well after like illness. She'd come off the pill and she went to a doctor and kind of said, look, getting all these symptoms. The doctor turned around and said to her, it's normal for someone at her kind of level of sport. A few years later, turned out it wasn't, and it was basically due to her health and well-being. She was having all these symptoms and the doctor had just kind of blown it off because she was an elite level athlete. And then we've got Katie Schofield as well, who's a New Zealand cyclist. She didn't have a menstrual cycle for 2 years. She had lots of digestive problems, night sweats, tired all the time. It turned out she had this thing called REDS, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later on. So if we go to the next slide. Thank you. So what can you do as a coach? So we want to really kind of get like a positive narrative going around food. We want to kind of be telling our players to remember to bring snacks in between tournaments, make it like a really normal thing to do. So even if you're bringing snacks yourself, to kind of set a really good example to show your players, you could have a group chat where you're sharing recipes with each other. You could say, oh, found this really good recipe for this like pre-workout snack, thought I'd share it with everyone. It's really important that in the 30 minutes after you exercise as well, that you're kind of eating something, getting something in you to help with the recovery process in the body. So it could literally be a glass of milk and some biscuits. That could be a really good thing that you could do. Pre-training, I know there was one question about this, kind of what should we be eating before we're training. If it is kind of the hour before training, it's getting near to it, you want something that's going to be a lean protein, high in carbs, just quite a fast energy release. If it's you're eating in the morning and you're not going to train for a few hours, you can kind of go for a bigger meal then. But if it's just before, maybe something like a banana, a low-fat yogurt with granola, kind of something like that, that's going to give you a fast release of energy. So yeah, it's just important we're kind of getting this positive narrative going. We want it to be as important that you're eating before matches as it is pretty much putting the right kit on. It like that's how it needs to feel. So if we go to the next slide, I'm just gonna have a little bit of a talk through some myths, because I feel like, especially with nutrition at the moment, there are so many things that get thrown around of what you should be eating, what you shouldn't be eating, what you should be doing, what you shouldn't. It's really important just to not get sidetracked by all the marketing, all these things that are saying protein bars and high energy drinks, and to actually make sure you're doing your own reading and research, because what it's saying on the packet doesn't necessarily mean it's going to do all of those things. Fasted training is something that's being talked about a lot at the moment, and it's actually not a very good idea for females to do it, because what happens when females do fasted training is it's breaking down your muscles. So we're going to have better quality training if we're eating before we arrive at the training sessions. And another thing a lot of people talk about is carb loading. Basically what this is, I think a lot of runners do this when they're doing like marathons and things like that. You basically, the days before it comes to your race or your match, you really up the amount of carbs that you eat, and it's meant to increase your stores. Again, works in men, not in females though. So for females, it doesn't work very well. And the best practice is just make sure you're fueling really well all the time coming up to your matches, not just a few days before. Because what will happen in females, if we're just suddenly eating loads of carbs the day before, it's actually going to probably just make you feel a bit rubbish in yourself. You're going to probably feel really bloated and stuff, and you're not actually going to have all those energy stores that you're apparently creating. Supplements, that is another big thing around at the moment that everyone's talking about. You need to take this, you need to take that. Again, a lot of the stuff you need, you can just get through your diet. If you're eating a really good balanced diet, you shouldn't really need to take supplements. The only exceptions, vitamin D. As everyone has probably realized, we don't live in a very sunny country, and therefore we don't get a lot of vitamin D. And so this is something that everyone should be taking in the winter months. And magnesium is another one that's quite hard to get through your diet, and we actually excrete it when we're stressed. So, for example, players, if they're stressed before a game, it's likely they might be getting lower in magnesium. So, coming up to matches, it could be an idea to take some magnesium supplements as well. If we go to the next slide. So reds, something that probably not a lot of people have heard about. I hadn't heard about it myself until I started doing these presentations. So it's basically relative energy deficiency in sport, and it's a really problem among high level athletes, but also just in any athlete, in any person, this can occur. And what it is a failure to kind of adequately fuel your bodies. So you're going to be kind of expending more energy than you're actually putting in. And can happen in a few ways. It could be unintentional, could be misguided. So you might think you need to be doing these things because it's going to make you better in your sport. And obviously in some people, it might be compulsive as well. So there's a lot of different ways this can manifest. And it's kind of this, as I said, it's a tip between the balance of fueling and training. So especially before matches, you might be doing a lot of extra training. And so it's important that you're upping your calorie needs and things like that to kind of match the training you're doing. So what can we look out for? So there's amenorrhea, which is a big one, and it is basically when females kind of stop having their periods or they become extremely irregular, and that's a really big sign that something's not right in your body. Georgia, as long as the mic's working, we'll talk a bit more about that later on. Another thing to look out for is kind of feeling cold, tired, frequently kind of getting injured, low mood, all things like this it's just basically bad signs showing that something's not right in your body. And it's important that you don't kind of just ignore these, because as I showed you with the examples with Pivot Founder, it is showing that something's not right. So if you don't sort it early, it can lead in the future to things like bone weakening, reduced aerobic performance, impaired adaptation to training. So it's something that we want to fix, basically. So what you could do, a really nice little example, is doing what we call the RAG rate for training. So before a session, you can kind of mark it as red, amber, or green for the intensity of the session to kind of give an idea of kind of how you might want to fuel for it. So obviously, if it's a red session, it's going to be quite an intense one. So you might give people a heads up. Might want to kind of eat a few more snacks before the session, bring stuff with them. Even if you know you're having a really intense session, maybe make sure you're giving some time to have some breaks in between. And obviously, if you're a coach, try and be vigilant. If you hear your squad talking about things to do with foods, just kind of make sure it's all positive stuff that they're talking about, because we really want to get a good positive talk around food. So if we flick to the next little bit, this is just all the signs to look out for, and then next one along. Yeah, so that is the main bit on nutrition. So we'll have a quick look at the injury resilience now. So this first bit is kind of talking about the pelvis. So women are actually 4.5 times more likely to get a non-contact knee injury. They're twice as likely to get injuries at other joints, and 20% more likely to have back pain than men. So why is this? So we have this thing called the Q angle, which you can see on the screen. And because females, they have a wider pelvis, it changes the Q angle compared to that of men. And when it's like this, it basically just means we've got more kind of force being like down onto like our knees, our ankles. It's just more angular forces basically through that knee joint, and it's making us more prone to injury there. Another thing that's quite interesting is actually our menstrual cycle, and where we are in it can actually affect your injury risk. So in the first few weeks, obviously we've got our estrogen levels are elevated, and it means we've got a bit more increased inflammation in these weeks, and so we're more susceptible to injuries. And then during the final 2 weeks, when our progesterone levels increase, we're going to have decreased coordination. So you kind of go the first half of your cycle where you're more inflamed and prone to injury, and then the second half you're more likely to have lower coordination. So it's just important to kind of think about that when you're training. Also, it's quite interesting, and I didn't know this, and it really shocked me when I found this out. Equipment, so things like football boots, they were actually all pretty much designed on male models, and they just kind of adapted them slightly to be smaller to fit onto females' feet. So they weren't actually adapted and created on female feet. So this is becoming a lot better now. Obviously, as more awareness is growing around this, they're kind of adjusting them to take into factors like we've got narrower heels and different arch support, and obviously we're having more weight bearing down. But yeah, so that's something as well. A lot of equipment wasn't actually designed for female bodies. So what can we do to kind of minimize some of these risks? We want to be strengthening our key muscle groups. That's an important thing in training. Want to focus on strengthening in the quads, the hamstrings, the glutes. Basically, it's just going to enhance our joint stability. We want balanced muscle development. So we don't want to just have quad dominance, which is actually what's more prevalent in females. So females in particular, we need to be strengthening our hamstrings. So maybe that's something you could encourage in training. Make sure we're stretching well beforehand and incorporating kind of strengthening drills. Core strength is another big one. If you can get better core strength, it's just kind of going to help your overall injury prevention, because it's going to give you a better grounding and hopefully prevent falls. And fundamental movement skills. So in something like football, kind of agility drills for acceleration and deceleration is super important. And then hopefully, if Georgia's microphone's working, this is where she should.
Can you guys hear me this time?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Success. Right, I'll take over then. So obviously Sophie's talked a bit there about sort of joint injuries, but as all sports do, contact and non-contact, we've got that risk of head injuries as well. So female athletes are twice as likely to suffer concussions than their male counterparts, but they're often under-recognized both on the field, as it says on the slides, but then also they're quite underdiagnosed off the field. So that statistic might be even higher. There's a few reasons for why female athletes are more at risk. Those being sort of smaller heads and less neck strength. I don't know how many of you have sort of done much concussion prevention training with your own teams, but it's quite well agreed that increasing neck strength generally decreases your risk of concussion. So of course that's going to work the other way against females. Our brain cells are built differently. They're longer and thinner, which can make them a little bit more fragile and a bit easier to damage. Often female athletes also don't have as much training for several reasons, partly just not getting into sports as young as maybe male counterparts, which means that their ability to fall correctly or perform other things like headers that might put them at risk of a head injury, that ability isn't often up to par. And then, as with everything else, we've mentioned the timing of the menstrual cycle. So again, like Sophie said, in those weeks where your sort of inflammation is higher, your brain's more likely to take more damage from a lighter hit. And then during those later weeks, obviously, if you're a bit less coordinated, you're more likely to take a fall. So if we go on to the next slide there, Lloyd. So there's a few different things we can do which can help prevent concussions on the pitch. So improving agility and proprioceptive ability, same as we said for the sort of joint injuries. For you guys, that'll be sort of like agility drills and maybe switching speeds, just trying to prevent any falls. Developing neck strength, like I mentioned, there's loads of different ways that this can be done, and there's loads of really good resources online for activities and sort of drills that you can do with your team to improve that neck strength. Then making sure that your players know how to fall and know how to perform movements correctly and in the safest way that puts sort of the least amount of force through their head is really important. And then these last two are, I think, two of the most important ones. So being aware of signs and symptoms and then managing that return to play. So we mentioned that female athletes are a lot less likely to have their concussions recognised. And that's because the typical symptoms that we all get taught in our sort of concussion training don't necessarily present the same in women, and there can be a lot of really weird and random symptoms that female athletes can experience, and there's a whole range of those. And I think even if you just talk to any of your players who've had concussions, you can pick up quite quickly that maybe the typical headache, nausea, memory loss isn't necessarily how theirs felt for them. So it's just learning those different ways that they can present. So I think from what I've read, often sort of behavioural changes are quite common, a bit more common in female athletes. And then we can send out some resources if you guys are interested looking at that. And then managing that return to play. So the initial presentation isn't quite the same, and the course of the injury might not be the same. So women can sometimes take sort of longer to recover from concussions. They can have more severe concussions. So it's just understanding that for those of you who are also coaching men's teams, that we might not be able to go about it exactly the same as we would for our men's teams, if that will make sense. So we'll go on to talking a bit about sort of sports bras and kit then. This is just a really quick whistle-stop tour through this. So a well-fitting sports bra is really important. I'm sure any woman who's ever done any kind of sport can tell you that, but it's a lot more important than I think people give it credit for. So not having that security and that support can lead to more breast movement during sort of running and any kind of contact. And as well as being just uncomfortable, it can really affect our performance. So it can often shorten our stride length, change our body position, so maybe making us a little bit more hunched over. And then it can increase the amount of energy we use sometimes. If you can imagine, if you're taking shorter strides and you're maybe not in the most efficient body position, it can take more energy, which over the course of a game can really make a difference. And then it can also increase how hard exercise feels, which can be one of the reasons that women sort of drop out of sports, which is obviously at the moment when we're all trying to increase numbers in the women's game, that's something we want to try and avoid as much as possible. So if we pop onto the next slide, this is a little infographic that you guys will have access to once you've got these slides that you can share with your players. And it's really useful just for showing players how a sports bra should fit. So it's a lot more than just, are you getting movement or not? So there's loads of different things to look at. So I won't go through all of it just because it's very wordy and you guys can have a look at it in your own time. But things like the straps being adjusted correctly so they're not uncomfortable, and then making sure that sort of the underband isn't too tight, isn't too loose, back straps, all those things can be really, you have to try and get them all correct. There's a couple of really good resources as well that when we send them out, which can sort of help players with fitting themselves or getting themselves fitted for sports bras. And there's some really good companies out there who do really high quality, really well fitted sports bras that would be really useful for you guys to maybe point your players in the direction of. So if we just hop back maybe to the menstrual cycle bit then. So sorry about the difficulties before. So yeah, so if we just jump through to the 3rd week, I think that's where we got up to. So far we're about midway through a cycle when we get to this point. This is that sort of 3rd week of the month, if you think of it like that. So at this point, the estrogen levels start dropping slightly. So all those feel good, high energy hormones are going down, and our progesterone starts rising. And progesterone can be a tricky hormone. It obviously has its uses, but it tends to lead to sort of decreased energy levels, poorer coordination. But what it can really help is with mental focus. So Sophie and I have done a lot of sessions at schools and things where, you know, you can recommend focusing on schoolwork in this week. But for you guys who might be dealing with players at very different levels and at very different ages, this might be a good time for you to encourage players to focus on any personal analysis. If you have particular tactics or game plans, this might be a really good time for players to give learning those a go. But it also might be a time where they might want to take a little bit of a step back and maybe not go as hard in their training sessions. It does increase our basal metabolic rate, and what that can mean is that players feel a lot hungrier, but it also slows our digestion, which can lead to, which coupled with maybe eating a bit more, can lead to quite a bit of bloating and discomfort, which again is going to worsen your performance. It also is a time when your muscle building isn't as good and your recovery isn't where it normally is. So it's maybe not the best time to be going for a personal best in the gym. But there are positives that we can use during this time, like I said. And then if we pop on to the last week. So this is the premenstrual phase, which is probably the most famous of them all for all the different symptoms it can cause and all the different problems it can bring. So during this time, both hormones stop being produced and our bodies basically go through a little bit of a withdrawal phase. So we've not got the high energy hormone of estrogen really, and we've also not got the calming effects of progesterone. So there's a lot of symptoms that can happen during this time. Some of them more common ones here, like headaches, tiredness, that sort of emotional instability, and then breast tenderness. Obviously, all of those can, again, negatively affect our performance. And any stress or inflammation, so injuries or sort of work stresses, can make these premenstrual symptoms a lot worse. So again, this might be a time where players feel more inclined to take a step back, but if we go on to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about what we can do then to help players. Oh, sorry. Just before we go on to that then, a little bit very quickly about, sorry, Lloyd, if you go back to the birth control bit. So if we just really very, very briefly talk about hormonal birth controls. So women on the contraceptive pill obviously don't, or any other form of hormonal contraception, don't have the same rhythm and weekly cycles as we've been discussing. This is a really difficult topic sometimes because it's a very personal decision, but there are quite a lot of effects of hormonal birth control that are maybe not super ideal for athletes. So some of the side effects that can decrease performance are sort of a raised cortisol level, reduced muscle mass, and then effects on sort of mental health and eating behaviors. There's not a lot of studies about the pill or any hormonal birth control and how it affects female athletes. But the evidence that we do have does indicate that it's maybe not the most useful medication for us for all those side effects I discussed. So it's not necessarily that we're suggesting that female athletes don't take the pill. It's more that we want to make sure that all the players are aware of all the side effects that they might be experiencing, even if they're not necessarily feeling them. And we want to make sure that everyone's making a really informed choice. So for you guys as coaches, it might be just making sure there's more of an open conversation in your clubs, and sort of pointing players in the direction of any information they might want to find, rather than having these conversations yourselves. But it is something really important to consider when you're having these conversations with players. So if we pop on to the next slide then, and we'll have a little bit of a chat about, now we've had the biology lesson out of the way, how we can apply all of this sort of hormonal knowledge that we've got. So we've got a little case study there about the US national women's soccer team. So in 2019, the team started tracking their menstrual cycles as individuals, and then that information was provided to coaches, and they used that to tailor personal training programs. This was at the same time as they went on to win the World Cup, and both the players and the members of staff have said that they think this initiative was part of what led to that success. Of course, at grassroots levels, that's maybe not the that's not plausible, but what we can do is encouraging players to sort of tailor their training to themselves. So there's no one size fits all. Some players will have menstrual cycles that don't even affect them. Others will have debilitating ones. So the advice that we tend to give is encouraging players to track their cycles, and not just tracking sort of timing of bleeding and things like that, but also trying to track things that affect their performance. So some examples of this might be players who have recurrent injuries, tracking when those injuries flare up or when they get re-injured, and seeing if that lines up with any particular stage in their cycle. Other players might track things like energy levels, or maybe how long it takes them to recover after a game, and whether that's different week to week. Or things like more quantitative things, so sort of personal bests can be really good to track, seeing if you can maybe lift more one week to the next. And what this means then is that players can use that information coupled with the stuff that Sophie's been talking about nutrition, and find the best way to prepare for their training sessions, and the best way to sort of manage their own time and their own energy levels within the week. For example, if a player knows that they're maybe on week 3 and they tend to be quite tired during that time, but they also know they have a really big game, they might take it a little bit easier during training so they can conserve that energy when it comes to game day. And then the other things that we can use, I don't know if you all remember right back at the start before all the technical difficulties, but we talked about how only 30% of players feel willing to talk to their coaches about this kind of this topic. So again, it sounds a bit wishy-washy, but just creating a space for open conversations about this and allowing players to discuss this with you and express their own thoughts and feelings and sort of adapt their training where they feel necessary. You might do all the right things and players might still not feel comfortable talking about this with you, but it's just trying to do everything we can to make sure it's a topic that your players are aware of and also feel that they can act on, if that makes sense. So I believe that's everything we've got for you. Thank you guys for bearing with us, especially with all the technical difficulties. I guess we'll hand over for questions.
Yeah, just bear with. I'm just going to check the chat function to see if anyone's pops them in. Let's have a look. So Marnie's asked, are there any physical and health differences that we should particularly be aware of with women going through menopause?
So this again isn't something that's been really well researched, and especially for sort of Sophie and I, where our work mostly focuses with sort of university and school age children, it's not something that we have the most information about. But what we can do is try and find some resources for you guys and send them over, and see if there's any particular advice on that. I don't know if Sophie has anything to add.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so we did a lot of our training through the Well HQ, and I know on there now they do have a whole section on menopause and perimenopause. So if it is something you are really interested in, that's probably a good place to go and look for more information. Like Georgia said, we've mainly been like focusing on schools and kind of university level players and girls and stuff. So I don't know much about menopause, but I do know that is a really good resource to find out stuff from.
Great, thanks. Got another question just came in from Sarah. What age would you recommend for the players taking vitamin D and magnesium?
Vitamin D, to be honest, probably any age can take vitamin D. Like I said, that isn't even just for players. I think that is just something that the NHS has said for just everyone living in the UK, just because we don't get enough sunlight, especially in the winter months. Magnesium, probably it would be, I would say, from about your kind of when the girls are hitting like menstrual age and stuff. When there's probably more stress coming in at school, especially, that's going to be a good time to start with magnesium. If you really aren't sure, you can always obviously go and get a blood test, and then a doctor can kind of say to you whether you do definitely need to take magnesium or not, and can also give you a bit of a guideline on whether there's any other supplements you need to take. I know another one that I didn't mention in the PowerPoint, but it's iron amongst girls. Obviously, when girls start having their periods, iron levels do typically tend to get low. So it is good to get a blood test just to check to see if you need to take any other supplements.
Got one here, Sophie. I work with younger girls, 11 to 12. Some just start and experience periods, etc. Anything to be aware of with that at the very beginning?
So something that's really common in the first few years of girls having periods is they're really, really unpredictable. So it takes about 7 years for periods to sort of like settle into that rhythm that we've talked about, where you're getting a monthly cycle and it's 28 days and it lasts 5 days and you can predict it. So probably something to be aware of is that while it's really useful still for these girls to be tracking these things, because even if they can't predict when, it helps them recognize that there's a reason why they're feeling the way they are. It's really important to still stress to them that if they're not having a regular cycle and if their symptoms aren't lining up month on month, that's to be expected and normal. Because I think a lot of young girls can often feel quite put off and a bit worried about the fact that they're not having this 28-day cycle that seems to be the standard. So just making them aware of that.
Yeah, and another thing, like adding on to that, is obviously, as you said, like for the first kind of few years, it is quite irregular. If they go to doctors and stuff, don't feel peer pressured into going on to hormonal birth control or any other form of birth control, because unfortunately, typically as a girl, if you do go to the doctor with any kind of symptom, anything related to your periods, the doctor will pretty much just say to you, go on the pill. But it's super important, as I talked about with RED and kind of things like amenorrhea and stuff, that you understand why you're having these symptoms and why they might be irregular. As I said at the start, obviously, first 2 years, it is just natural. It takes a while to get into a rhythm with it. But if there are issues, work out the issues. Don't just use kind of hormonal contraception as a kind of bandage, I guess, that's just going to cover up the problem until you come off the pill, because then the problem is it will just come back, whatever the initial root cause of that was. So it's super important that you work that out.
I think we might have taken it out of this PowerPoint just because, but one of the things that we mentioned to the school age girls was if they never had regular cycles before they were put on a hormonal birth control, it's really quite important to have got to that stage at some point, just because without that, you're not getting the sort of positive effects of the hormones. So in particular, you're not having that sort of bone health that comes from estrogen levels. So especially for athletes, that can put them at much higher risk of an injury. So of course, we're not medical professionals, but it is maybe something just to suggest to your players, if they're that young, to maybe look at other avenues to help with their symptoms if they're struggling and they're thinking about it. Are there any more questions?
Doesn't seem to be, Georgia. Lloyd?
Yeah,
No,
I've just seen as well the I was just gonna say I've seen the thing that just got put in the chat about the blue bag as well. I was just gonna say that's a great idea. If anyone hasn't seen that in the chat, obviously just making sure at training, maybe having some spare shorts, some sanitary products, and just maybe coming up with like a bit of a silly name for it so it's not embarrassing, like for girls to have to go and use it and stuff. Really good idea though, because you do get caught out, and especially as we just said at the beginning, the first few years where it is very irregular, it can just kind of come at any point. So just kind of having something and making it not an embarrassing thing, because as a girl it feels like the most embarrassing thing in the world at the time, so making it so that it's just as normal as possible is a really good way to do it. So yeah, having like a bag of equipment is great.
I think I just saw a question as well, just asking about sort of apps that players can use for tracking. So the one you've mentioned is a really good one. There are so many. I could go on for another hour about them, but two of the really popular ones are called Clue and Flow. So they're not particularly targeted at athletes, but they do both have the option to sort of add your own symptom in if it's maybe not tagged already, which can be really useful for players tracking like injuries and things like that. But honestly, most of them are built pretty similarly. It's just finding one that you're happy to use very often, up to every day, really. So finding ones with sort of the right graphics that are easy to use is really important. So encourage girls to sort of look around and try different ones. But Flow and Clue, I think, are two of the ones that most people I know use.
Great stuff. Any last minute questions, guys? No?
Nothing, right?
Okay. I mean, when things go wrong on Teams, I'm quite happy to blame Microsoft first. And I'll be doing that tonight, absolutely. I think I speak on behalf of everyone. Sophie, Georgia, that was absolutely brilliant. Can definitely be hard and not easy over Teams to deliver such a thorough and contextual webinar. Sometimes it's difficult to make it relate to the certainly a grassroots community when it's very evidence research based. But that was fantastic. Obviously, those that have joined us tonight will definitely share the recording and the slides. We've had a great blend of those that have attended tonight from within the county, from outside the county, both female and male. And hopefully we can support our county with more female health related CPD. Those on the call may have seen the new release of the FA strategy for women and girls titled Reaching Higher. Female health is going to be embedded in one of their key focuses moving forward over the next 4 years, and hopefully beyond that, our next 4-year strategy. So that's going to take different shapes and sizes, whether it be embedded in the odd workshop here and there. Those that are aware of the Equal Game workshop, that'll be something that's incorporated as one of the modules, not this season, but next. So, yeah, I think the FA have really reflected on this being a real important topic that kind of hasn't been discussed as much as what it should. So, a massive thanks to both Sophie and Georgia. Also want to say a big thanks to Maddie Wood, who has been in the background tonight, the Community Sport Development Officer at Newcastle Uni, who has really helped myself and Gary put this on with the help of both Sophie and Georgia. So big thanks to Maddie as well. Yeah, and that's it for me. Anything from you, Gary?
No, I've just put a message in the chat, thanking everyone for joining tonight. Been a pleasure. Thanks for giving up your time, and hope you found it useful.
Well, thanks everyone.
Thank you guys for having us.
Thanks, Sophie, Georgia.
Yeah, thank you.
Apologies again about the technical issues.
These things happen.
Well, yeah, definitely. All right, well, that's everything. Thanks everyone, and we'll no doubt see you soon. Cheers.
Cheerio.